This is the last stop off the road in Panamint Springs, California, in the desert near Death Valley, one of the most desolate and forbidding locations in North America. Did Patricia Partin, also known as the Blue Scout, stop here in 1998 on the way to her appointment with eternity? We can't know, but we do know that her bones were found not far away 5 years later. Partin was a disciple of reclusive New Age guru and cult leader Carlos Castaneda, whose inconvenient death brought his closest followers into a state of crisis and set up an enduring mystery that remains mostly unsolved 23 years later. What happened to the witches of Carlos Castaneda? Hi guys, Sean Munger here, historian, teacher, author, podcaster, and this is part 2 of my interview with Joe Bui, who does the Desert Trippin' series on his YouTube channel, where he visits deserty locations in Southern California. He recently did a video where he went to Panamint Springs in the footsteps of Patricia Partin. It's linked below. And we had a fascinating interview to talk about this case, its historical background, and the whole Carlos Castaneda phenomenon. If you haven't seen the first part of our interview, I highly recommend going back to watch it, as it sets out the basic story of who Castaneda was and how he came to have a compound of women followers who hung on his every word and who are conjectured to have committed suicide after his death in April 1998. The first part of our interview is linked below. Now let's move on. There's a lot of controversy on the web regarding Castaneda and really, especially in the last couple of years. But really the main issue appears to be whether, what Carlos Castaneda wrote in the 60s and 70s was literally true as a matter of historical fact. We believe it's not, but there are people who do believe it is true. I was always more interested in this story about the women who went missing.
Yeah.
And I was interested in that story because the cults really didn't start back in the 60s when he was writing the books that got most of today's fans into it. There's a lot of people who read these books in the 60s and 70s and since then who they have said, oh, it changed their life. And that wasn't the cults that these women were in. It's related, but it's not that he didn't start. Yeah, he did not start out to do that. And it was really this group that eventually went missing in 1998 that was kind of the reboot of the philosophy, and the reboot, particularly in a commercial sense and a personal sense. Again, if you read Amy Wallace's account, there was kind of a cult of personality around Carlos Castaneda.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happened to the women, the witches and the others who were attached kind of to that group? Maybe I unfairly used the term witches, but that group, I think, came from had a sort of a different mindset than many of the followers who are fans of his books and his work, which are, it didn't really happen the way that Castaneda said it happened.
Right.
But that doesn't make it illegitimate in the sense of it's not a legitimate means of searching for spiritual meaning. Right. It's perfectly legitimate. But the story of the cults and the women who went who went missing in the 90s is, I think, an offshoot of that story. And I think critics who are very kind of touchy about this whole subject tend to conflate those things. And I'm not sure it's fair to conflate them to the degree that some people do. At least that's just my sense.
That exact debate you're talking about is what kind of drew me back into this whole topic, because I was one of those people in the 70s who read it as a young man and really adopted it. It meant a lot to me. I did some of the exercises rather successfully, and it actually scared me to the point where I had to put the teachings down for a while, and I stepped away. And then when you're a young man, you get distracted, cars and girls and school and whatnot. So before you knew it, fast forward, 30, 40 years later, I find out about this giant debate, and I don't know what to think. And I've kind of thought about it since then. it seems like all of the criticisms of Castaneda are true. Like he probably didn't, he fictionalized all of his characters and his sources. There's evidence that one of the first women that he was involved with at UCLA was a librarian, Joni, who had a connection to the Indians out in the desert to the east of us. And she took him up there, I think maybe in the Morongo area or something. And that's where he first maybe met a shaman who taught him about, hallucinogenic drugs. But he sort of, um, what is it, homogenized everything into this narrative that he made into his reality.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, his teachings and his writings do line up in the fact that as a sorcerer, you're bending reality all the time, and convention. So I've kind of come to accept that both sides of the argument are true.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he was totally full of shit, but yes, all of his teachings were 100% true. So there is room in the middle to live in both places, and it just depends on what your perspective is. If you're academia, it's going to hurt you and it's going to piss you off that most people have to work very hard to get their PhDs. But if you're in the world of sorcery, it's like, yeah, he just gamed the system the way a sorcerer would do, and he was the greatest at it. So that's kind of where I netted out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and this is one of the things that kind of interested me, and I know I touched on this in my video, is that could only have happened, I think, in that cultural moment, that very brief window at the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s, when people were looking for meaning in those places, basically, these kind of different sources of spiritual understanding or of personal meaning or of personal discovery. And there was a brief window where people who were very good practitioners of that kind of art could become the equivalent of sort of a public intellectual or a popular religious leader. And then that window closed in the early 70s. And I think Castaneda, this is speculation, but I think Castaneda knew that window was closed and that he couldn't get back to that place where he had been in 1968 or 1972. And so what do you do then if you've kind of made your bones, so to speak, in this milieu where that type of thing is possible in a cultural sense, where a publisher is going to publish books about that, where people are going to hear about you and seek you out because of those things. And now it's 1980 or God forbid 1990, and no one's doing that anymore. What do you do? And so I think that's what's so interesting about his story, because he's sort of like he kind of outlived the moment where he was relevant, and then that sort of led to his downfall because the cult was sort of a substitute for that never really reached the level that I think he may have hoped to regain.
And the underlying factor was the financial gains and popularity and fame that he was getting from it became addictive. I read the first 4 books and they were as valid to me as the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And the Bible uses a lot of allegory and, symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
But after reading the 4 books, and I hardly read any books at the time, when the 5th book came out and I read it, I think was it The Eagle's Gift or something, or one, it was like the same 99% the same story that you would have gotten from the first 4 books, and then the 6th book was like almost a carbon copy of the second. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And it felt like he was just rehashing shit at that point and trying to milk it, as they say, to get a little more money out of the deal while it was still happening.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what turned me off to him. And I sort of, not off, but just away. And I took what I had gotten from him and was grateful, but it was time to get off the bus at that point. And I think, living this lavish lifestyle now, there was the image of him from the books and then the reality of him in real life. So I think somewhere in there, he got, like you said, trapped up in the, in all the fame and almost like the addiction to that kind of limelight. So
yeah, Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I'm going to bring in something kind of from left field here, but if you contrast Castaneda with another author of controversial sort of spiritually based texts, that being Whitley Strieber. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Mm-mm.
He was a horror novelist in the late 70s, early 80s, and then he claims to have had abduction experiences with extraterrestrials. He wrote a famous book.
Haven't we all?
Yeah, well, of course. So, but he wrote a book in the late 80s called Communion, and then wrote a couple of other books sort of describing his experiences with aliens. This was in a totally different cultural time and place. We're now in the 1980s, kind of the Reagan era. And but there's a trajectory that's kind of similar there. Obviously, major questions were raised about the veracity of his accounts, which were probably not true. But there was this very kind of spiritual, the aliens unlocked all of these spiritual dimensions and these religious dimensions and that sort of thing. And Whitley Strieber, who's still alive, has now kind of fallen into sort of a new age kind of twilight where there's kind of an undifferentiated sort of mass of people and writers like that who are kind of in this place to which the closing of that cultural window where that kind of thing, the kind of thing that Castaneda did, was able to be so big. Now that that window is closed, that's kind of where that stuff sort of dwells now. And so it's interesting to contrast sort of Castaneda's career with Whitley Strieber's career, contrast those and to see both the similarities and the differences.
Yeah. Let me pull things back to, but Patricia, who I became most fascinated with, I think you've answered all my questions, but my last question for you was, is there anything I forgot to ask about her, or is there any insight, maybe a personal one, even if it's just a speculation, any thoughts or insights about Patricia? We know that she was only like 18 or 19 when she first met him, and she was married to a guy for 18 days. And that guy might have also been one of the devotees at some point. The two of them kind of went into this together, but any more stuff that you dug up in your research that might be an insight into who she was as a person?
Well, I think the best insights come from the Amy Wallace book, Sorcerer's Apprentice. There were not many people who knew her well. And I think, as you point out, like her entire adult life was in this group and kind of derived from Castaneda's aura, so to speak.
He called her his daughter and he adopted her.
Yes, he
He was
did
also
adopt her legally,
heterosexual.
which was actually done, I believe can still be done in California for non-familial reasons. But I think that her life was, I can understand, the great sort of bewilderment that she and others in that group must have felt when he died, because their whole life was bound up in this, their identity was bound up in this. I mean, this is one thing that cults do, is they sort of supplant a person's identity with their kind of programming. There's been a lot of stuff done on this. The recent HBO series on Heaven's Gate and Nexium, another cult that's been in the news lately. It's about identity. QAnon is in the news too, and it's about supplanting identity, really. So I when I think of Patricia Partin and what happened to her, really the thing I think about is just how terrified she must have been when this happened. And like, what am I going to do for my life now? Where do we go from here? If he's gone and your whole life is wrapped up in that, where do you go from there? So it's not I don't make a value judgment on that at all, because I think it was obviously a very profound thing that must have happened. And I mean, you've been there, I haven't, but my guess is that that's a pretty raw place out there in the desert.
It's
And
pretty horrible.
yeah, and to go out there and be, put yourself to the mercy of those elements
I,
without
you
a
know,
plan of coming back. I mean, that's a pretty big thing a pretty big decision to make.
what's interesting about that area is that after having read some of his books and some of the locations in his books and the sense of power and energy in some places, that place definitely has a vortex of energy, whether it's wind or heat or whatnot. But just the way it's nestled between two sort of parallel mountain ranges, it's like a dry lake bed. And when you see it with the colors and the tones all around it, the sand dune glows almost like has a luminescence and these spires of sand.
Just your familiarity with that area, are you familiar with a terrible 1970 movie called Zabriskie Point?
I think I am, because I was at Zabriskie Point. I think we might have watched it in '96. It was already an older movie at that time.
Right. It was.
And I don't remember anything about it. So
Yeah.
Other than there was a kind of interesting couple or something that were.
Yeah. It's sort of a notoriously terrible movie in the history of cinema. It was made by Antonioni, one of those European New Wave directors, and they brought him, again, same era, late 60s. They brought him in to do kind of a counterculture picture. And so he made this film, which is so bizarre as to be virtually unwatchable. It got terrible reviews. It was a huge box office bomb. Yeah, but I mean, it's really interesting in that it was sort of a marketing ploy about youth culture and counterculture in the late 60s and everything that was kind of swirling around in that era. Very simple plot, and it's about, a man and a woman who run off together and make love in the dunes at Zabriskie Point, and that's basically the whole movie. But it's worth a look if you haven't seen it in a while. Yeah. It's very strange.
I definitely want to watch it again.
Very strange.
I want to thank Joe Bui for reaching out to me and doing this really interesting interview and giving me a chance to delve back into the subject of Carlos Castaneda and his Tensegrity witches. I have a couple of podcasts: Second Decade, that's a historical show about the 18 teens, Green Screen, the environmental movie podcast, and I'm starting a new show soon called Age of Confusion, which is an alternate history story podcast. That'll be out, I hope, in March. So if you like this video, please like, subscribe, share, etc. Do all the stuff that you normally do for a video you like. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon with some more historical thoughts.